Thank you, Acting President. And I rise today to speak to this Education and Training Reform Amendment, Protection of School Communities Bill. And look, I think from the outset I'm greatly troubled by this bill. I think the objectives of the bill are obviously commendable. The process in 2019, where there was a task force that reviewed the issues around violence in schools, seemed to be an excellent process. The recommendations that came out of that task force were excellent, but this does not reflect that. Does not reflect that. Now, as many of the other speakers, and it just doesn't, I mean, it's been interesting to hear so many teachers speak today, and I don't think I'd quite fully recognised the number of teachers that were in our chamber, and it's very pleasing to hear their experience in this. So, according to the independent wellbeing report conducted by the Australian Catholic University and Deakin University, more than 40% of principals reported being a victim of physical violence in 2019. Threats of violence towards principals has increased dramatically. In a survey that was then undertaken by the Principals Association, they found that parents were the main offenders of threats, bullying, sexual harassment, conflicts and gossip. However, students were responsible for the most cases of actual incidences of violence. And this included, as we've heard from some of the contributions, punching principals, throwing broken glass at principals, holding them up with a knife. And yes, all workers should be safe at work, without doubt. And the data shows us that workplace violence is on the rise across the board. The number of nurses that are now being assaulted in health settings has increased by a shocking 60%. And that's just in the last 3 years. And we know that we've seen rises in family and community violence as well. Now, I know that in 2016, the Education Union pleaded for greater protection of students, greater protection of teachers rather, pointing to the link between the rising number of students with a disability entering schools and a spike in violence against teachers. And this certainly does go to the nub of the advocacy and the letters that I have received during our investigation and review of this bill. So, does this bill address the rise in violence in our school communities? Does this bill address the rise in violence against staff from students? No. As I mentioned, that task force in 2019 made 12 recommendations on preventing and reducing violence and aggression in schools. The recommendations went towards preventing violence and said that it required a sustained four-tiered, multifaceted approach, building positive school climates and upskilling the education workforce, strengthening schools as safe workplaces, strengthening early intervention and information sharing, and enhancing support for students with highly complex needs. All very sensible recommendations and very sensible broad objectives. They then went deeper into that with their recommendations, and these included maintaining the safe school programs, addressing violence and building cultural safety, those kind of the resilience that we want to see schools provide or help our students achieve. It also talked about educating support staff and building skills in trauma-informed education strategies, and certainly hearing Dr. Bark and Mr. Grimley and Ms. Barth all speaking about the challenges that teachers had and the skills that they had to have to deal with those is really commendable. But the recommendations from this task force was that there needed to be more. It did say to consider the benefits and risks of legislative change that enables harsher penalties for threatening or aggressive conduct towards school staff. That is the only part of the task force recommendations that goes towards this bill. It's the only part. Now, my team would say that maybe the benefits had been considered, but certainly not the risks of this legislation on the families, the community, and ultimately, and most importantly, on the children. Serious cases of violence and the threat of violence can and should be dealt with through existing legal mechanisms, notably personal safety intervention orders issued by a magistrate. And obviously, when urgent assistance is required, the police. Now, the government hasn't explained to myself or to the stakeholders that I spoke to why the police and personal safety intervention orders are not adequate, that we need more. And I note that this is effectively creating a parallel system, but it's a parallel system where an official without legal training, without any, I would say, procedural fairness, can basically issue an intervention order, can actually even order a parent to participate in a program. If this was about addressing an imminent risk with a temporary measure, is that the time that you pull out your notebook and write in an interim order when there's an imminent risk? I would say that's actually the time that you would ring the police. So I've got a number of questions that have been raised with me, and I spoke to a number of stakeholders, and I know that I have heard from the members of the government that they had great consultation with Parents Victoria. Parents Victoria do not agree. Parents Victoria do not agree that this was good consultation. In fact, I have like 2 pages of questions from Parents Victoria about this. Probably the most important one is, what does harmful, threatening or abusive mean? And I note that Mr Grimley also has raised a number of questions from Parents Victoria. I think probably more concerning, well, not more concerning, but also concerning, was that the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service, now they are listed as a supporter of this bill. It has been said that they support this bill, that they have been concerned from this bill. Well, I don't know if anyone else got today's media release. They do not support this bill. They have huge concerns about this bill. And they have said that they have been that the Parliament may have been misled in stating that they supported this bill, because they don't. They think that this bill will create unfair outcomes for Aboriginal children and parents, and they're right. There's no, I haven't heard any evidence even today in the contributions, which I've listened to carefully in the briefings, that we need this. Now, we know that education is a key protective factor that reduces the chances that marginalised children, and particularly Aboriginal children, will come into contact with the criminal justice system. We know keeping them in school is one of the most important ways of keeping children out of the justice system, of keeping kids engaged in school, is so important. We know, and I'm sure that many of us have had an opportunity to read the landmark report, Our Youth, Our Way, that was published this month, and that was from the Commissioner for Children and Young People. It found that leaving school early or experiencing chronic difficulties engaging in education while at school can push some children and young people towards the youth justice system. Now, I know that we all know that. We all know that. So excluding parents from engaging with the children's education risks those students themselves becoming disengaged. And I think Mr Grimley also said, if there is a parent that is obviously has some issues, I suspect that the best thing we need to do is keep that child engaged with the school. So disengaging from the parent runs the real risk of disengaging that child. In 2016, 10.6 of 15 to 24-year-olds in regional Victoria were disengaged with education, compared to 8.4% in the greater capital cities. Over 4 million kids are enrolled in school in Victoria, and that means that over 40,000 of them are disengaged. Now, I don't believe that this bill will service those families, and instead it will probably drive more children to disengagement. This bill, the powers in this bill are highly intrusive and would ordinarily only be exercised by a court. And again, I say, you know, you're asking a principal to make some extraordinary considerations and decisions about a parent, including an order that could exclude them from school life for 12 months. And this does raise a lot of questions about how that parent can still remain engaged with their child's their child's education. Now, we also spoke to Amaze. They also have considerable concerns, and I know, and I have no doubt that many of you have had meetings with parents of children who are on the spectrum, parents of children with disabilities and with special needs, and the fights and the battles that they go through to ensure that their child gets the education that they need and deserve. And they are constantly battling at it. And today I raised it as a constituent question, that the Northern School for Autism does not have enough electricity at their school. They are running on generators because they have received no funding, because they have been overlooked time and time again for funding. So yes, I think you are going to get some parents who are frustrated. But you know what? Disengaging them from the education system, telling them they can't come near the school, that they can't comment, that they can't drop their kids off at school, is not the answer. And this is why I am really concerned about this bill. We don't know we also don't know what it means, and I think Mr. Grimley raised this in his contribution. We don't know how many times, what harmful gossip is, what it means to make a threatening remark on social media. And I know from personal experience, threatening remarks on social media are viewed and read in very different ways by lots of different people. So I think that the rights of families and children may be limited by the proposed bill. It interferes with the ability of a parent, carer or family members who are subject to an order to attend school events, accompany children on excursions, school camps, volunteer at the school, communicate with school staff or otherwise engage with a child's education at school. What our community needs and what was recommended by the Protective Schools Ministerial Task Force are safe and effective circuit breakers to prevent violence and to more clearly define mechanisms for addressing underlying causes of anger and frustration, and for setting relations right, and in the interest of all children who have a right to be educated in our school system. That is what the task force recommended. This bill does not do that. South Australia, Queensland, and I won't go on, but South Australia and Queensland have taken a very different approach. South Australia included a statewide bullying prevention strategy, and that was engaging with students, teachers, principals, parents and carers. And that appears to have great support from all different groups of people. The Queensland State Government also recognised the need to increase support funding for children with disabilities and behavioural difficulties. They focused on student engagement and identified an engaged student as one who participates in all areas of school, feels included in the school and has feelings of belonging, is personally invested and takes ownership of their learning. This bill does not do this. This bill does not even attempt to do this. And so I'm greatly concerned about it. I'm greatly concerned that the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service has not supported this bill. They are feeling very frustrated that the Parliament may have been led to believe that they did support this bill. They are very concerned about the impact of this bill, that this bill will have on the families most in need of support and the most marginalised children in Victoria. We're talking about, really, if there are problems like this, we should be dealing with them. We should be de-escalating this. We should not be kicking these parents out of the school family. We should be embracing them. We should be looking at early intervention to do this. That's what I want to see. That's what the task force recommended. That is not what is in this bill. So, look, I've got a few questions which I will I will leave to the committee process, but in its current form, the Reason Party cannot support this bill.